Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. Marco Mendicino is facing criticism over the transfer of serial killer and rapist Paul Bernardo to a medium security prison. CBC News uncovered Mendicino's office was made aware of the transfer back in March, but the minister maintains he was not informed until May 30th, though the Prime Minister was briefed the day before him.
Is it standard operating procedure at your office that you are kept in the dark? And will you let anyone go in response to the handling of this?
Of course not. And my job as the Minister of Public Safety is to make sure that we are identifying issues where there are challenges on information flow. And so what I have done in each and every one of these cases is to be responsive to those challenges by issuing ministerial directives. As far as internal matters, I've dealt with it.
So what's next for the Office of Public Safety and Marco Mendicino? Let's bring everybody in. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne and Althia Raj. And forgive me again for my voice again this week, you guys. I swear that I'm on the mend. Chantal, let's start with you. We have seen examples in the past of public safety ministers who are surprised by information around offenders and then can't do anything about it because Corrections Canada is a separate entity. How bad is this politically specifically for the minister at this point?
Well, you can have a discussion about the fact that politicians should not be micromanaging specific cases that correctional services are handling. But you need to have a larger conversation about the fact that the minister, a public safety minister, seems to be out of the loop of issues on which he should have had a heads up. Now, Mr. Mendicino says he never was told about this by his staff or by anyone before he found out that the transfer had actually happened. The opposition says he's lying. My problem with this is my mind is boggled by the notion that his staff, having been told by the Prime Minister's office, would not pass on the heads up. Yeah. But at the same time, Mr. Mendicino is a former Crown prosecutor. I can't believe that he would have such poor judgment with that background not to know that this was an issue that would become delicate politically for the government.
It's perplexing on a bunch of levels, I think, Andrew, in terms of why he wasn't told and then why he reacted the way he did, even though he did know one day before. It's all very perplexing.
Yeah, there's a context to this, of course, a couple of contexts. One is, it seems to be a pattern with this government generally that ministers, including the Prime Minister, will say when an issue heats up, oh, I wasn't told. Yeah. You know, the Prime Minister's office on the whole thing with the Chinese interference. Well, we didn't know. It wasn't translated to us. Bill Blair was saying the same thing. Yeah. Harjit Sajjan said, I didn't read my emails when a senator was offering fake passes out of Afghanistan. So there's that context. And secondly, there's a suspicion, not necessarily ill-founded, that Mr. Mendicino may not be telling the whole truth here. From previous experiences, people have some reason to doubt when, for example, he was saying that when they invoked the Emergencies Act, they did so on the advice of police. So you put those two together. I don't know if it's a resigning offense. Frankly, it would be a resigning offense if he had interfered with a decision of the correctional services. We don't want politicians to be deciding who goes to which jail any more than we want them to deciding who gets arrested or put on trial. But you certainly want ministers to be kept in the loop, and you want them to be setting down ground rules with the people who work for them to say, I want to be kept informed of things. I don't want plausible deniability.
And it does seem that Minister Mendicino has had some challenges. This is a kind way of saying it, Althia. There's been challenges in his portfolio, and I don't know if that's him or his staff or both.
That is a kind way of saying it, Rosie. Well, first, I would say he misled the House of Commons on the Emergencies Act. I think if we're looking for a firing offence, in my view, that would have been one. But then there was also confusion around his own firearms legislation. There's confusing information from him and his office about the police station that are apparently run by China. He seems to have misled on that. And so he's almost a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. Like maybe he's telling the truth this time, but because of his actions on the other files, it's harder to believe him. But giving him the benefit of the doubt, I think it's still very bizarre that nobody is being held responsible. And to that, I mean, you saw that question being asked by a CBC reporter, and the opposition has been asking it as well. You know, why hasn't anybody resigned? If somebody in his office knew of this, and apparently behind the scenes we're told that, well, staff were told and they were dialoguing with the department and they were told that there was really nothing they could do. If Corrections Canada thought it was so important that they would warn the department and they would warn PCO, clearly they thought there was something that the politicians might be interested in knowing. And Mr. Mendicino's own actions so far in his conversation with Corrections Canada that led to the review, in his issuing of ministerial directions, these all show that actually actions could be taken. So why would you not inform the minister? And so I think those are legitimate questions, and I think they deserve to be answered. I think I would also flag that, you know, kind of 6 degrees of separation. Mr. Mendicino's chief of staff is a woman who used to be Katie Telford's former executive assistant. They're very close, Katie Telford being the chief of staff to the Prime Minister. So, you know, who knew what when and who was told, and was the minister purposely kept in the dark, or is this just the directive he has given to his staff? I find that very perplexing.
Chantal, then Andrew. Chantal, then Andrew. Chantal.
In this very centralized system, normally when word comes out of the PMO to a minister's office, people take notice. That's how the system works. Now, if in this case they take notice but don't tell the minister, there has to be a sense, and to Althia's point, that this is a minister that we'd rather not tell things to. If that's the case, he doesn't necessarily belong in cabinet anymore. But to have a minister say, a public safety minister, say this is outrageous about a decision by Corrections Canada, rather than say what both Andrew and I have said, which is you do not micromanage at the political level what Corrections Canada does with people, is also astounding. So when you look at the entire picture, it's one big mess with very few saving graces for the minister.
Andrew.
The culture is set from the top. The minister sets the culture in his department, in his office. The Prime Minister sets the culture for the government. So, you know, if this sort of thing is going on, not just in this office, which is troublesome enough, but more generally in the government, then it's the Prime Minister ultimately who should be held to account on this. I think the other thing to note on this is it's not just a matter about whether ministers are being kept apprised by their staff. There's also just the role of ministers generally. It's kind of telling that the Prime Minister found out about this before the minister did, at least according to both of theirs account. And if ministers have dwindled in significance to such an extent, if things are so centralized in the Prime Minister's office, it may be the case that staff are simply cutting out the middleman and taking their concerns and their issues straight to the PMO rather than to the responsible minister, and that's troublesome as well.
But you would want to give PMO a heads up, I would think, right? Like you would want the centre to know that someone like this was being moved and to expect it as an issue to manage.
But you would certainly want the responsible minister, if ministers have any role whatever.
Yes, it's not for the PMO, and the PMO got the heads up. It didn't get it from Mendicino's office, but you would certainly find normal in a normal government that the minister in charge of public safety be briefed and take care of this file and be the points person on it.
Althia.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't expect your staff to tell the Prime Minister's office before they let you know, months before they let you know. So I agree with all of that. I think 2 things on this front that I think that's very interesting. One, obviously, we're having this conversation with the backdrop that we all expect a cabinet shuffle in the next few weeks, at least before the House returns in September. And so it will be very interesting to see if Mr. Mendicino remains, not just in his portfolio, but remains in cabinet, because what message is the Prime Minister sending by keeping Mr. Mendicino in cabinet? And the other thing I'd like to just mention briefly is that we are seeing a very stark differentiation between the opposition and the government when it comes to the way that they treat serious criminals and the correction agencies and the way that they want to treat punishment. That to me is a kind of like the policy conversation that we're not really having, because those differences have become very, very stark in the last few days.
Chantal, does this, what does this tell you about the state of the government in terms of whether it needs to hit a refresh button or something? I mean, this is one minister's office, but there are other things going on too.
Well, refresh button, when you have a culture that's set in over 8 years, and Andrew is right, that starts from the top, is very hard to push. I think possibly a shuffle, because there are weak links. At this point, they've become glaringly obvious. You keep hearing about prorogation, a new speech from the throne. I'm not convinced that a throne speech would do anything except get people to say, this is a government that has run out of fresh ideas. You can't reinvent your agenda every 18 months and have people believe that you're a serious government.
But you can refocus on your ideas, the ideas that you have and that you haven't executed yet, Andrew.
Well, but there's the operative word, haven't executed yet. One of the recurring themes of this government, it seems to me, is they seem kind of overwhelmed. Think of all the appointments, for example, in the judiciary and elsewhere that have gone unfilled for so long. Mm-hmm. They're trying to run so many things through the PMO. This was a government that came to power, remember, saying cabinet government was back. That's turned out to be a complete fallacy, completely false. It's never been more centralized. And one of the consequences of that centralization is stuff, language that doesn't get done. The government looks exhausted and overwhelmed. So maybe they need to go back to the well of saying, maybe we need to start taking cabinet government seriously and delegating authority so you don't get these kinds of snafus over and over again.
Althia?
I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I think the ministers are far less managed than they were in the Stephen Harper era, but there definitely is a bottleneck in the Prime Minister's office, and decisions do get put off and get delayed and get delayed and get delayed, and I think that is a source of frustration for a lot of cabinet ministers as well. I don't know that the government needs to hit a complete reset button with a throne speech and prorogation. I think they probably need a cabinet shuffle. They need a cabinet retreat. They need to decide what they want to refocus on. They've already, they will be changing the clerk of the Privy Council at the end of this month. They've already shuffled the deputy ministers. So, this is kind of like the government's last act. And this week we saw in the Abacus data poll that 80% of Canadians want change. 50% are like, let's get rid of the Liberals, but 31% are like, yeah, I want change, but I don't really know if any of the alternatives speak to me at the moment. Like, that's a silver lining in a way for the Liberals. I mean, it's certainly a silver lining for the opposition, but it is a silver lining for the Liberals. They need to refocus, and this could be their last act.
Welcome to another round of At Issue. The RCMP announced this week that they are investigating claims China intimidated MP Michael Chong. This comes after RCMP commissioners say they were not shared on that intelligence.
With regards to the MP Chong, we found out about it through the committee here and through the media.
Opposition parties have begun to discuss a replacement for David Johnston, who resigned after weeks of partisan attacks. The Prime Minister says he wants all parties to work together going forward.
If we can move past the toxicity and the partisanship that has characterized the approach by many parties and actually take this seriously, work together and figure out a way to highlight everything that is being done and what next steps can be taken.
Okay, so what comes next when it comes to foreign interference? Will there be a public inquiry? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Althia, and Andrew, good to see you all again. Althia, why don't you start us off on this? We didn't all have a chance to talk after David Johnston resigned late on a Friday, but there do seem to be discussions, perhaps productive, I don't know, discussions happening about what the next steps forward should be.
Well, they seem to be discussions and much more productive than they have been at any time until this very moment. So I guess that's a good sign. Yeah. The opposition is talking to the government. The opposition is talking to each other. Yeah. The government has put a public inquiry back on the table. I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit like, do you remember electoral reform? How the Prime Minister kiboshed electoral reform and then came out months later and was like, well, I was supportive of electoral reform if you wanted a preferential ballot. It's kind of like that. Like, no, I never took a public inquiry off the table. He certainly didn't seem to be a fan of it. But now it looks like it could happen. The NDP House Leader Peter Julian told reporters today that the parties could sit down, the four parties could sit down shortly, maybe with the Greens. I don't know, I didn't actually ask that question, but to hash out what the terms of a
Yep.
public inquiry would be,
Yep.
to talk out some names. We saw the Bloc Québécois actually come out with its list, and one of the names on its list was Louise Arbour, who, lo and behold, also was a Trudeau mentor. So I think it kind of showed the pitfalls
Yes.
that not doing your diligence can have. So I think there is movement. It seems productive.
Yeah.
The parties are talking.
One of the things, though, that struck me, Andrew, when I interviewed Dominic LeBlanc on Sunday was I just kept saying to him, but we didn't have to, we're just back to a place we didn't need to be at. Like, there was nothing has really, I mean, his point was something has happened, but nothing has really moved. And now the government kind of has to start again, which to me seems, anyway, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they may finally be doing what they should have done in the first place. I mean, if we want to talk about toxicity and partisanship,
Yeah.
when you're talking about something that involves potential election interference, that obviously engages the interests of all of the parties. And yet what we had off the top was a process that was unilaterally dictated by the Prime Minister, a rapporteur who was unilaterally chosen, not only without consulting the opposition, but over their objections. So now, yes, maybe we're going to have a more collaborative process, although the first thing you're seeing out of the government's mouth is kind of going to the other extreme of saying, well, you guys choose a process and you guys choose a leader. What I think everybody wants is a collaborative, genuinely consultative process, get everybody in a room together and come up with something that all sides can support. I think, Althea mentioned the electoral reform debacle. I think there's a well-founded suspicion that they may be setting this process up to fail. So the Prime Minister can at some point say, well, there wasn't consensus, so therefore we're going to stick with our original plan.
Although it seems like there is starting to be consensus. I mean, if Pierre Poilievre says, I'm willing to talk about this, that is a good sign, at least at this stage, that things are headed in the right direction, Chantal.
Well, there has been a consensus on the opposition side
Yes.
of the House of Commons for a while.
That's right.
And that is to have a public inquiry. Where there are differences is in the NDP and to a lesser degree, the Bloc's sense that it should be a larger scope than just Chinese interference, which I think is probably dangerous in the sense that if your scope is so wide, you're not going to have focus anymore. And if you don't have focus, it becomes a talking shop. And that doesn't make for a really interesting inquiry. The problem, I think the biggest problem between the opposition and the government, and where some will have to put water in their wine, is on the timeline.
Yeah.
I don't think it works to give an inquiry 6 months on a topic like that. So if you want a productive inquiry, you cannot guarantee that you will have a final report in time for the next election.
Yeah, and that may be where the rubber hits the road, as it were. But it does also sound, I will say, on a final note, like Dominic LeBlanc is willing to consider a lot of the parameters of a public inquiry even before they get to the name of who would do it, which will be the other challenge. Yeah.
Does he have a choice, really?
Yes, probably not. Probably not at this stage. Okay, thank you all very much for this. Appreciate it.